May we start?
I want to get your opinion on something.
To the bigger picture.
Now it's time.
From B Media Production, this is Podcasting Essentials.
Hi, and welcome to episode 16 of Season 3. I'm Nick Schildberger, Managing Director of B Media Production. For this episode, we'll be doing a wrap of Podcast Movement, the largest podcast conference in the world, with two people who were there. It was held in Florida this year, and Sharon Taylor, friend of the show and Managing Director of Omny Studio, moderated a session at Podcast Movement and has returned to join us today. Hello, Sharon.
Hello, good to see you.
And our very own B Media Production producer, Nicole Goodman, also attended the conference. Hello, Nicole.
Hi, Nick.
So nice of you both to join us here after your big trip to the US.
It was Florida in August, so it's nice being back.
It is nice being back. My hair has calmed down. I can now wear it out. In Florida, no.
No good?
No good. But
Great
it was good. It
conference,
was
though.
Fantastic. Yeah, good conference, bad weather.
I'm very jealous. I've never been. This year was the biggest they've ever done, 2,800 attendees. 5 years ago, only 600, although 600 is a pretty good effort 5 years ago.
Well, they're doing two conferences next year now. So one in LA at the start of Feb and then a normal one in Dallas in August.
Yes.
So it's going to be like a next kind of tier. So it's obviously grown to such an extent they now want to have more revenue through the door.
But also, I mean, on that point, I kind of felt that there were a lot of sessions this year, like almost too many and a lot of crossover. So I think a lot of moderators, panels found that there weren't enough people in each session. So perhaps next year they could condense, get more people at each session and not have so much overlap.
Ah, interesting.
Now, Sharon, you moderated a panel.
I did.
All about advertising and monetising podcasts for brands.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit about what was said?
Yeah, so the crux of the panel was it is still really hard. There's 750,000 podcasts out there now, and for the most part, even though brands and advertisers, it's no longer a question, as one of the people on the panel from an ad agency said, it's no longer a question of whether you should podcast or whether podcasting is able to make you money if you're advertising on it as well, or if there's no results to it. It's just the fact that there's not enough people still coming in to get the ads, or how to open up that funnel, I suppose, a little bit wider. And so we had a great chat. We had a few people. We had Sarah Van Mosel from Stitcher, we had Ryan Rose from Dax, and we had Giles Martin from Oxford Road. And so agency, network, and obviously brand reps to talk about what podcast advertising is doing in 2020 and beyond.
So what is it doing?
It's making people quite a good amount of money. So it's interesting, we kind of talked about whether or not direct response, which is your usual host-read ads with a visit www.podcastname/brand or coupon or something, or podcast at the end of it. And there's some great numbers coming in from that. And obviously the fact that direct response advertisers keep coming back means that it's working. And then we also kind of touched on the dynamic ad insertion. Doesn't seem like you can do a podcast advertising panel without talking about DAI at the moment out there, and how to get your podcast and your brand into agencies. And so I think on the agency side, they feel like they want more than just Casper Mattress. They want more than everyone in Australia that listens and hears ZipRecruiter ads. And so I think we're ready now for more ads and more brands to get involved in that space. And that was kind of the main vibe. Hopefully you were in the audience, Nicole. What did you think?
Yes.
This is a test. Were you in the audience?
Yes, I was in the audience, Sharon. It was interesting, a really great session. And from a brand perspective, I think it's always interesting to understand particularly what the difference is between perhaps what a brand ad is versus what a dynamic ad insertion is. So maybe you can talk a little bit to that, because both have their pros and cons.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that regardless of whether you're doing a direct response style of advert, and so those ones that say visit X website / whatever, or if you're doing more of a dynamically inserted style of ad, technically it's still dynamically inserted. So you can make a live read with a direct response sound quite native and quite baked in. It's those pre-recorded spots that people think are more like radio spots. So as a brand, you can buy 40,000 impressions with just a pre-recorded ad that you make and then insert over those podcasts as well. But you can still make that sound quite native to the show. And so I think the technology behind them can be largely the same. It's just the style of ad that I think we're now kind of talking about.
Yeah, it is the style of ad. And some of the stats that are coming out as well saying that host-read or talent-read ads seem to have more relevance or resonate with listeners more. But then there's, for people that aren't influencers on the show, then, is it dynamic? Is it brand? Something else I heard at another panel was going too far down the road of throwing in advertiser-made ads could end up making podcasts sound like commercial radio. So there's a very thin line between listen, this is a good problem to have. I think we're talking about, money coming in, but do we stick with host-read, talent-read ads, or do we really kind of go down that commercial radio road?
Well, I don't think it has to be either or. And so there's reporting out recently, confirming the IAB's predictions that we're going to hit $1 billion of ad revenue in 2020, I think it was, or 2021.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a binary choice between a podcast ad and a radio ad.
Yeah.
Radio ads work in radio because of the style of audio that radio is. You have to have something really punchy that catches someone's attention because radio is more of a lean-back experience. Podcast ads can be dynamically inserted. You can still mass sell and insert ads. They just have to be created with respect to the medium. Like, it's just a different advertising channel. And so I think you could still do a direct response ad, or you could still, voice the ad. Look at NPR up first. They do host-read ads, but they dynamically insert them, but you wouldn't know that because it sounds like the same ad reader every time.
Yeah.
I think the debate of does baked in have to be in the host's voice? I mean, if you're Mark Maron, yes, 100%.
Sure.
Most podcasters aren't Mark Maron. And so the medium will move forward with this if some of us have to pull it kicking and screaming into the future.
Exactly.
But it will definitely move forward.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to consider too and to remember is that there is the stat 50% of users actually trust an ad more just because it's in a podcast. So the environment itself is inherently trustworthy.
Correct. I mean, the efficacy of podcast advertising, the efficacy of podcasting in general, whether or not as a brand you want to create your own podcast or if you're going to advertise on podcasts, I think has now been proven. And this is kind of what was baked in and solidified, no pun intended, into the minds are coming out of our panel, I would hope.
Yes.
And so now we just need to try and find a way to bring in a lot more traffic at the top of that funnel.
So what I'm hearing really is that brands have really got more choices now. More choices the way they advertise. They can produce their own content like we do for a number of shows that we've talked about. Do you think, Sharon, both those options are going to increase? It was a feeling at Podcast Movement that brands still want to produce their own stuff as well as advertise?
Yeah, I think in general the pie has gotten bigger, and whether or not you're having a slice of advertising or having a slice of branded podcasts, there's more people playing in this arena. And so we're going to see more and more of both in the next couple of years.
And speaking of different people in the space, Tom Webster, our good friend from Edison Research, did a session at Podcast Movement about his class listeners now into two groups, rookies and veterans. Now, rookies are those that have started listening to podcasts in the last 6 months, and veterans are those like us that have been listening for at least 3 years, and in some cases, many more years than that. Nicole, do you want to talk about some of the interesting differences between rookies and veterans?
I do. What really stuck out for me, I love it when the data bears out in reality. So it's not just a whole lot of numbers that are thrown at you. You can actually see the results. So in particular, he showed us some stats that said that rookies listen more regularly to a daily news podcast at 43%, whereas 30% of veterans regularly listen to a daily news podcast. Now, both are listening and finding these podcasts, their favourite podcasts, by different channels. Rookies, interestingly, are going to the big competitors to Apple Podcasts. They are finding them at Spotify and Pandora, whereas the veterans are still going to Apple Podcasts. Now, the next few slides he put up were the top podcasts for Spotify and then also the top podcasts for Apple Podcasts. And it is exactly as he said, which was like, the clicking together of
puzzle pieces?
Puzzle pieces, thank you. The puzzle click together.
We've got different audiences, basically. The Spotify audience for podcasting is more rookie.
Skews a bit younger. Yeah.
Skews a bit younger.
Yeah.
And they're finding different podcasts because younger people have different interests. That makes sense. But more than that, rookies, there's more females.
Yes.
So more females, more Spotify. These are the things that brands need to think about when they're positioning again, either in producing content or advertising or just using those platforms, you've got different audiences starting to become apparent in different places.
Yeah. Well, in relation to daily news podcasts, what was interesting was when they put up the Spotify top podcasts, straight at the top was The Daily, NPR News Now, WSJ Minute Briefing. I mean, these are all daily podcasts that those just did not turn up in the Apple podcast top podcast list. It was fascinating. I mean, it was more true crime, and Joe Rogan, of course, makes an appearance again, but just fascinating to see how it represented.
And how rookies are finding podcasts too. They're
Yes.
finding them through social media, YouTube. A lot of podcasters, particularly in the US, will film themselves while making the podcast, put those clips into YouTube, which is where the rookies are finding it, whereas the veterans are still relying on word of mouth
Yes.
and more traditional forms.
Old school.
Again, it's great to see the audience growing, but
Yeah.
it does have a flow-on effect to how you market your podcast.
Correct.
If you're reaching a younger, more female-skewed audience, then look to those ways. And
Yeah.
if you're looking towards a slightly more male-dominated and potentially more mature in age audience, then you market to them slightly differently. There was a video that Tom showed with clips from rookies and clips from veterans. And obviously I can relate to the veterans because they were talking about the kinds of podcasts that I listen to and the way I've got involved in podcasting. But the rookies are saying, I only listened to podcasting when they started showing up in Spotify.
Yeah.
Yeah. Spotify grew and took market share really quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's crazy. But that's because people have never been on... I mean, people that are listening to audio are on Spotify, but are those people that were listening to audio listening to podcasts? And that Venn diagram, tasty.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing.
Let's move along to another area that was discussed a lot at Podcast Movement, I'm told, which was smart speakers. Did you go to some sessions about smart speakers?
Yes, I did. Everyone's talking about smart speakers. There's a lot of brands doing interesting things in that space, really kind of short-clipped content, which makes sense from a budget perspective too. You know, there was also an article out. Reebok launched a new product through a smart speaker where you just had to mention a code through the smart speaker and you could go into the draw to win.
Now, that's not podcasting. It's audio, and that's, we're
Correct.
here to talk about all forms of audio and how brands can use audio, not just podcasting. Smart speakers are an opportunity for a whole range of audio interactions. That's a great example that Reebok did where you can talk to your smart speaker and enter you into a competition.
Yeah.
But Sharon, you've done some stuff actually more in the podcasting space with NPR.
Oh, yes. We have very recently launched a new project with NPR, which we are playfully calling NPR Replay internally. So, in a nutshell, we essentially, for those that might not be aware, there's this hugely popular radio show in America by NPR called Morning Edition. And so they were looking for a way to syndicate this nationally on smart speakers. Now, the really interesting stuff here, and where it gets kind of exciting, if you'll allow me to nerd out over audio for a second.
You are bouncing up and down. You're excited.
Yeah, for those that can't see me. So what normally happens with NPR is that if you said to your smart speaker, hey speaker, play Morning Edition, it would pull from the NPR mothership. So there is a single version of that show, which technically hadn't really been podcasted before, and it would just pull it straight from there, and there's one version of it. Now, with smart speakers being in the home, there's a huge opportunity for localised content, like short form and localised, because obviously we know where you are, what city, etc. So what we did with NPR was we basically ingested all of the streams of all the 300 plus radio stations in America that have a version of Morning Edition, and we spliced in together some localised news content. And then NPR did a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of building out that Alexa skill. I cannot overstate their role in this enough. But obviously using the technology of us in the background at Omny, they were able to build out the front end of this skill. So if you are in Las Vegas, you get a different localised version of this news show than if you were in Texas, for instance.
And it all happens within like 5 minutes of it being on air on radio.
Yeah, so the rub is that they wanted to do it without disrupting or changing any of their internal processes, without any human involvement. It was an epic project to work on.
Yeah.
It's fantastic,
Yeah.
and it's such an exciting thing in audio and in smart speakers, because I think for a long time I personally have felt that we've all waited for podcasting on smart speakers to explode, and somehow that would be this new mecca of listening, whereas the reality is it's a lot like I know I've said this before, but it's a lot like Kevin Costner, Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. And the reality is you're just not going home and randomly asking your smart speaker for, hey, do you know what a podcast is? And then trying to teach people what that is. But a show like Morning Edition on NPR that has millions and millions of daily listeners, suddenly to be available and to use that as a jumping off point to teach people about the audio that could be available on smart speakers. And even if we just were able to plant some seeds in brands' minds or other audio producers about what is possible if you think about dynamic content and localization and what that means as a listener experience, it just gets me really excited.
Absolutely.
I absolutely love it. I think it's so smart and so logical. I mean, and then you've helped with the tech side to make it all happen. We talked on a previous episode about the Chompers podcast.
Oh, yes.
Where you can, for kids brushing their teeth, a new sort of 2-minute episode every morning and every night. Clever branded content.
There's also Zyrtec, I think, have a pollen cast available on smart speakers, so you just get the pollen count for the day. I mean, that's smart, really smart.
I just think there's so much more in audio and in smart speakers especially that brands and audio producers could be looking at doing if they just think outside the box a little bit, if they had the right people to bounce ideas off. So it's great. It's really exciting.
And the ad agencies, I think they need to step up too, because this is it's a place to be creative, and there are creative agencies out there that are not probably thinking enough about audio at this point.
No.
So if you're listening,
think more about it. And also, it comes down to your audio strategy, which we've spoken about, Nick, before. It's imperative to have an audio strategy for brands, but also to now include not just podcasting, but sonic branding, smart speakers, in-car experience, sound in its entirety.
Yes, correct.
Yeah, definitely. Now, to finish, Sharon, I want you to keep your nerd on because
no worries.
I want to talk about IAB version 2 certification.
I can hear the people falling asleep at home already.
Yeah, and it's a tricky one because it's something that a lot of our listeners probably don't really need to know about specifically, but there has been a lot of talk about it in the press, and where brands will care is when they are getting a certain number of downloads to their podcast being reported back to them from their host. And then because of this IAB compliance, suddenly they could expect those numbers to decrease. And that's probably what we need to explain why that's happening. But first of all, can you just explain what IAB compliance is?
Yes.
In layman's terms.
Challenge accepted. Okay, let's go back a step to go forward. So the IAB is the Interactive Advertising Bureau. It is a global organisation which helps put forward policy and measurement guidelines across a number of mediums, not just audio, digital advertising and those types of things. They recognised, let's go back 3 years now, the IAB realised that what maybe one host or podcast company was calling a download might not match up in an apples-to-apples comparison with what another host was calling a download. And this is for a number of reasons. So technically, as a hosting provider, what you want to be doing is filtering out those downloads that you know are erroneous. You know, you want to be filtering out bots. You want to be filtering out server farms, or Amazon co-location facilities. You want to be making sure that when you say to a client, whether that's a brand or whether that client is then passing that information back to a brand who's advertised on their podcast, you want to be able to say that these 10,000 downloads were, to the best of my ability, known downloads. So someone actually listened. Now, podcasting is a bit of a black box. We've never really been able to get true consumption out of all 100% of kind of listening endpoints. And so that's why the IAB's gotten involved starting a few years ago now, where they said, here are some guidelines that we think that everyone should be adhering to make sure that there is apples-to-apples comparison in numbers.
Which is important for advertisers who are spending money either creating or placing ads based on the number of downloads.
Correct.
Or the audience that are listening to either their podcast or their ad. So it is really important.
It's hugely important, not just the bots, but as a real-world example, before this filtering methodology came out, there were those of us that have always done best practice and have always assumed that, some things shouldn't be counted as 2 downloads. But it is possible that a hosting provider years ago, if you were listening to a single episode and you were scrubbing, so if you were searching through the podcast feed, that episode, and moving backwards and forwards, every time you move backwards and forwards to a new mark, that could be counted as a new download. And so these are the things now that as an industry we need to make sure, and it goes back to what we started talking about at the top of the podcast, which is as more advertisers, as more brands come into the space, you want to be able to say with certainty, this is my number, and as confident as I am in it, this is accurate. So let's move forward to, I think it was September, October last year, where a whole bunch, 36 different podcast companies from all across the globe got together and said, IAB guidelines are great. We need something a little bit more stringent. And that's where this IAB podcast measurement V2 came into it. It was a revision of those initial guidelines. It was a lot more stringent. It had a lot more specifics around how you should measure certain things, whether or not you could look at logs and see that 60 seconds of the audio had been downloaded. There was just a lot more meat to it.
So why now are suddenly downloads decreasing all of a sudden?
So there is a difference between IAB V1 as the guidelines and what they technically say should happen in IAB V2, and that is impacting some content. Depending on your episode length and a number of other factors, most hosts see on average about a 20 to 40% drop in numbers when they move from IAB V1 to V2.
That 40% is huge.
It can be substantial.
But Omny Studio, not so much because you've been compliant for quite a while.
Yeah, so we built in IAB V2 filtering when it came out last year. We've always been quite stringent with our filtering, and so we actually do quite a lot of secret sauce behind the scenes to make sure that the numbers we're giving out are as accurate as we can give out.
Right.
And so V2 for us was reasonably simple as a tick box, but we did have publishers that saw some fluctuations because there are nuances in terms of filtering windows. So if you, Nick, start an episode at 5 p.m. today and you then pause that episode and you pick it back up again in 5 minutes or 60 minutes or an hour or 24 hours, those numbers fluctuate. And so as hosting companies are going through an official certification process with IAB, we are seeing people start to publicise more drops because maybe they were filtering to an extent, but now they've come out of the certification process and they've been told you also need to do X, Y, and Z so that as an industry we can compare apples and apples, and that's where those new drops are coming from.
Yeah, so really, it's summing up. It's good news because we're getting more accurate numbers.
It's great news. I can put a piece of paper in front of a brand or a company and say, these are your numbers, and there's confidence in that. Like, that's how to move an industry forward.
I think in the past, it's been measurement and attribution has been a real issue for brands. It's kind of held them back a little bit from getting involved in podcasting. Now, with IAB V2, it should give them some comfort and really propel forward brand integration with podcasting.
100%.
For sure.
A very nerdy way to finish. Is there anything else you want to add, Sharon?
I'm pretty happy with the nerdy finish.
Okay,
Is there a better way? I mean, please.
Yeah, you have been excited this episode.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for joining us again today. We
Thank
hope
you
to
for
get you
having
back
me.
at least once more this year because there's some more exciting news coming which we can't talk about yet,
Yes, there's quite a few exciting things coming down the pipes.
particularly for brands, I'm told.
Yes.
Yes.
By you, which means it must be true. And thank you very much, Nicole, for bringing back your take from podcast movement. And now you're back, you can keep making some podcasts for us.
Get back to work.
Yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Nick.
That's it.
Thanks, Shaz.
Well, that's it for this episode of Podcasting Essentials. For more about us and how we can help you create a podcast or audio strategy for your brand, you can go to be.com.au. From all of us at B Media Production, thanks so much for listening.